Death Row 2027, full execution list and America's most shocking killers. Welcome back to Justice Reversed, where real crimes meet real justice. Today, we're taking you through the full list of U.S. death row inmates scheduled for execution in 2027, who they are, what they did, and why their cases divide the nation. Number 1. Keith LaMar. A riot on Easter Sunday changed everything for Keith LaMar. A protest over forced medical testing spiraled into chaos, leaving him fighting not only for his life but for the truth. Keith LaMar, also known as Bomani Shakur, entered prison at 19 after pleading guilty to a fatal robbery in Cleveland. But his life took a dramatic turn in April 1993 during the Lucasville prison uprising, a standoff triggered by opposition to a TB test conflicting with religious beliefs. Over 11 harrowing days, the riot led to 10 deaths. In its aftermath, prosecutors singled out LaMar as the mastermind behind murders of 5 inmates suspected of being informants. Despite the state's narrative, no physical evidence, no fingerprints, no weapons linked him directly to the killings. His conviction relied solely on inmate testimony, often from those granted deals for cooperation. LaMar maintains his innocence, stating he was neither affiliated with the gangs nor present in the cell block where the murders occurred. Crucially, he asserts that the prosecution suppressed exculpatory evidence, alternate confessions, eyewitness accounts contradicting their version, materials that could have cleared him. Instead, the trial proceeded before an all-white jury in a predominantly white rural county, a backdrop that LaMar says amplified racial bias and political pressure. He recounts his experience in the memoir Condemned, written from his cell at the Ohio State Penitentiary, portraying himself as a scapegoat sacrificed for swift closure rather than justice. Legal scholars, civil and civil rights groups such as the ACLU and the Center for Constitutional Rights rallied to his cause. In 2011, LaMar led a hunger strike behind bars, drawing national attention to his fight. His website, keithlamar.org, serves as a platform for sharing legal updates, advocacy campaigns, and educational resources about his case. Despite multiple appeals, the Ohio Supreme Court upheld his sentence. A scheduled execution for January 13, 2027 remains on the books, although Ohio's current moratorium casts uncertainty over whether it will ever be carried out. Critics question the integrity of his conviction and the broader fairness of the process. Supporters frame LaMar not as a killer, but as a casualty of a justice system that prioritized expedience over verifiable truth. Whether Ohio chose justice or convenience is still debated, and until then, LaMar remains locked behind bars, a man awaiting a death sentence built on testimony, not proof. LaMar's case challenges us to confront fundamental questions about accountability, bias, and the limits of capital punishment. Here is how we can take warning from his story to avoid miscarriages of justice. Never underestimate how racial and geographic bias can shape a jury and a verdict. Prosecutors must be held accountable for withholding evidence, especially when a life is on the line. Convictions based solely on incentivized testimony demand heightened scrutiny. Justice must rest on proof, not politics or convenience. Number 2. Gregory Lott. The fire didn't kill John McGrath instantly. It lingered, like a slow-moving sentence. The 82-year-old was discovered days after someone tied him up inside his East Cleveland home, doused him in lamp oil, and set him ablaze. He died from pneumonia triggered by the burns, a death as cruel as it was calculated. Police arrested Gregory Lott, a 24-year-old with prior burglary convictions. According to law enforcement, Lott confessed to the break-in and assault. But no tape, no written statement, no signed admission exists, only the police's word. The evidence was circumstantial. There were no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses at the scene. And McGrath, before dying, described his attacker as a light-skinned black man with long hair. Lott was darker-skinned and wore his hair short. That discrepancy was never shared with his defense team until after he had been sentenced to death. Tried by a 3-judge panel after waiving his right to a jury, Lott was convicted of aggravated murder and sentenced to die. But from the beginning, questions shadowed every aspect of the case: how evidence was handled, what was disclosed, and how the verdict was reached. In the years that followed, more cracks appeared. In 2002, the U.S. Supreme Court barred execution of individuals with intellectual disabilities. Lott's attorneys argued he qualified, presenting evidence of limited cognitive function. Prosecutors disagreed but never introduced medical experts to counter the claim. In 2023, the Ohio Parole Board reviewed the case. By a vote of 6-2, they recommended clemency. Their report cited disturbing flaws, suppressed evidence, lack of mitigating psychological testimony, and serious doubts about whether the prosecution had met the burden required for death. Even the aggravating circumstance used to justify Lott's sentence has since been discredited by a state-appointed legal task force. Prosecutors pushed back, arguing that clemency undermines the rule of law. But in a telling moment, they downplayed the role of McGrath's family, acknowledging they had no known relatives who objected to clemency. Still, Lott's fate remains uncertain. Ohio has struggled for years to carry out executions amid legal challenges and pharmaceutical restrictions. Most recently, his execution, scheduled for February 15, 2024, was pushed again, this time to April 14, 2027. The reason: Ohio's lethal injection protocol has collapsed under legal and medical scrutiny. Gregory Lott has now spent nearly 4 decades awaiting a punishment Ohio can barely enforce, for a crime its courts no longer seem confident they fully understood. The deeper tragedy lies not only in what happened to John McGrath, but in the haunting possibility that Ohio sentenced a man to death without ever proving it beyond doubt. And from the smoke of this case comes a caution we can't ignore. Eyewitness descriptions that don't align with the accused must be fully addressed, not buried. Confessions with no recording, no signature, and no documentation should never be the foundation for a death sentence. Withholding key evidence is not just misconduct, it's a direct threat to justice. When the truth is filtered, delayed, or denied, the justice we seek becomes no more certain than the flame that took John McGrath's life. Number 3. John Stojetz. The stabbing of D'Amico Watkins in a juvenile cell block was neither accidental nor spontaneous. It was orchestrated by inmates under leadership and fueled by racial hatred. On that morning, 17-year-old Watkins pleaded for his life while hidden blades and ideology delivered a chilling verdict. John C. Stojetz, a member of the Aryan Brotherhood, led 5 adult inmates into the juvenile unit at Madison Correctional Institution in Ohio in April 1996. They overpowered prison staff, seized keys, and hunted down Watkins. Twice he fled, twice he was recaptured. Finally cornered, he begged, but Stojetz and another attacker stabbed him repeatedly with homemade shanks. The result was death on a floor meant to house minors. That image would haunt the justice system. Stojetz was indicted for aggravated murder with the statutory enhancement that the victim was killed while incarcerated, making him eligible for the death penalty under Ohio law. A jury found him guilty, and the court imposed death. His appeals raised fundamental issues. Stojetz claimed his defense failed to screen jurors for racial bias in a case defined by racial animus. He allegedly suppressed evidence relating to his diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder from a prison assault in 1987 when his throat was slashed. At sentencing, a psychologist testified to that trauma, but prosecutors minimized the PTSD, and the Ohio Supreme Court gave it minimal weight, calling it an excuse rather than mitigation. Stojetz later discovered that medical records confirming the injury had never been disclosed to defense counsel, a potential Brady violation. He also challenged testimony that misrepresented his mental health history. Every court, state and federal, denied relief, often on procedural grounds. Claims of actual innocence, bias, and suppression were rejected or barred. Despite a final U.S. Supreme Court refusal to hear his case in 2018, Stojetz remains alive on Ohio's death row. His name has appeared on execution lists repeatedly, only to be postponed due to Ohio's inability to procure lethal injection drugs and a de facto moratorium. The latest scheduled date is May 19, 2027. This case underscores the collision of racial violence, prison gang control, and legal process. A child was murdered under conditions that blurred punishment and vigilantism inside a state institution charged with protection. Stall blocks and appeals, procedural refusals, and execution delays leave Stojetz in a liminal space. You cannot speak of justice delayed without asking what happens when it is denied, distorted, or withheld. Until then, one man sits in a cell, waiting, not for justice, but for resolution. And in that silence, the system's failure echoes louder than any sentence. And now, a caution rooted in his story, shaped to guide prevention. Racial hatred inside correctional systems must be monitored and stopped before it turns fatal. Trauma-related mental illness in violent settings requires full, court-reviewed disclosure. Withholding medical or psychological evidence in a capital case undermines justice at its core. When prisons allow bias, neglect, and secrecy, they don't just fail one person, they endanger everyone inside. Number 4. Archie J. Dixon. Christopher Hammer's death wasn't a moment of rage. It was a planned, cold, calculated, and carried out with deliberate cruelty. On September 22, 1993, Archie J. Dixon and Timothy Hoffner attacked their roommate inside a shared Ohio home. They struck Hammer with a wine bottle, tied him to a ladder, stole his ID and social security card, and left him bound while they dug a shallow grave. Later that night, they returned. Hammer, 22, was forced into a car and driven to a wooded area. He was allowed one last cigarette, a final moment of calm. Then came the gag, blindfold, and restraints. Dixon and Hoffner laid him in the grave, still alive, and began covering him with dirt. He struggled. They pressed him down. Once the grave was filled, they stomped on it to seal him in. The autopsy confirmed what investigators suspected: Christopher Hammer had been buried alive. Both men were arrested and charged with aggravated murder, kidnapping, and robbery. Dixon's girlfriend testified. His confession, though contested, was admitted. The jury returned a death sentence. The trial court agreed, citing the calculated cruelty and motive, financial gain. Dixon's defense presented mitigating evidence. He had grown up in a home marked by abuse and alcoholism. Diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, his upbringing had been shaped by violence and trauma. But the jury gave little weight to these factors. His appeals followed every possible route. A motion to suppress his confession was initially granted, then reversed. The Ohio Supreme Court declined review. The U.S. Supreme Court did not intervene. Post-conviction motions were repeatedly denied. Outside legal circles, some called for clemency. The Forgiveness Foundation, a faith-based group, highlighted his background and raised spiritual concerns. Their message focused not on overturning the sentence, but on urging reflection and transparency. Still, the court stood firm. No new trial. No commutation. Just time long and unresolved. Dixon has now spent over 30 years on death row. His execution has been postponed multiple times, most recently set for June 16, 2027. But Ohio's death penalty system is faltering. A lack of lethal injection drugs has led to an unofficial moratorium. The state continues to sentence people to death but rarely carries it out. Archie Dixon planned a murder. He dug the grave before committing the crime. A young man was buried alive. The law was clear. But decades later, that sentence remains unfinished and the system that imposed death now struggles to deliver it. In his prison cell, Dixon waits. Not for mercy, not for exoneration, but for a punishment that may never come. And that delay forces us to ask, if justice must wait forever, what does it become? And from this story, we're left with critical warnings. Signs of escalating violence in shared homes must prompt immediate intervention. Roommate tension can turn lethal. In death penalty cases, a defendant's psychological history deserves serious weight, not token mention. If the state can't carry out a sentence, it must reassess the purpose of imposing death at all. A system that can't finish what it starts risks losing credibility entirely. Number 5. Timothy L. Hoffner. He thought they were friends. But the two men Christopher Hammer trusted most turned out to be the architects of his death. On a cold night in 1993, they forced him into a shallow grave alive, gagged, blindfolded, tied, and the dirt fell fast and his life ended from there. Christopher Hammer was 22. That summer, he lived with Timothy J. Hoffner and Archie Dixon in Toledo, Ohio. Their motive was money, to steal Hammer's car and forge his documents. Yet the cruelty of their method would define the case. On September 22, 1993, inside the shared home, Hoffner grabbed Hammer in a headlock and tried to break his neck. When that failed, Dixon struck Hammer in the head with a wine bottle. Hammer pleaded for his life. They tied him to a ladder, rifled through his possessions, then left to dig a shallow trench in a wooded spot. They returned later. Hammer, still alive, was gagged, blindfolded, bound, then pushed into the grave. Hoffner and Dixon shoveled dirt over him, pressed him down, and stomped across to seal the grave. The brutality shocked the community. Police swiftly arrested both men. Witness testimony, especially from Dixon's girlfriend and forensic detail, reinforced clear premeditation. Hoffner was charged with aggravated murder, kidnapping, and robbery. A jury found him guilty, sentencing him to death. Key aggravating circumstances: kidnapping, robbery, and murdering a man by burying him alive. During sentencing, Hoffner's troubled childhood emerged. Abandoned by his mother, raised by relatives, diagnosed with antisocial and schizotypal personality disorders. The court acknowledged the trauma but ruled those factors didn't outweigh the crime's severity. Appeals followed. Hoffner's conviction and sentence stood through state and federal courts. No innocence claims gained traction. But over the years, execution dates were deferred repeatedly. Originally set for June 18, 2024, Hoffner's execution was postponed not for legal reasons but because of Ohio's inability to obtain lethal injection drugs. Hoffner remains on death row, convicted but unexecuted. His case highlights a growing contradiction. The justice system sentences him to die, yet cannot carry it out. The law says one thing, reality says another. Timothy Hoffner may not be the first man to bury a friend alive, but he may be among the last forced to wait decades for a punishment the state cannot deliver. Today, Hoffner lives in a system uncertain of how to finish what it once demanded. And thus a haunting question remains: when justice is delayed not by doubt, but by dysfunction, can it still be justice? From this haunting case emerge lessons we must heed. When a murder shows signs of planning and cruelty, early intervention and monitoring of at-risk individuals is essential. Mental health disorders must be thoroughly evaluated and meaningfully considered during sentencing. If a state cannot enforce the death penalty, it must reconsider its use. Prolonged limbo serves no one. These warnings remind us that true justice demands clarity in conduct, accountability in mental health assessment, integrity in enforcement, and courage to reform when systems fail. Number 6. John D. Stumpf. She opened her front door out of kindness. Minutes later, she was lying face down in her bedroom, shot 3 times in the head. Her husband was beside her, bloodied but breathing. The crime lasted only minutes, but the aftermath would span nearly 4 decades. Mary Jane Stout was 54, a mother of 3 living in a quiet Ohio town with her husband, Norman. On May 14, 1984, 2 strangers knocked on their door. John David Stumpf and Clyde Wesley said they needed to use the phone. The Stouts let them in. They shouldn't have. Stumpf and Wesley were drunk, armed, and looking for money. Once inside, they forced Mary Jane and Norman into the bedroom at gunpoint. Norman was shot twice, once between the eyes and again at the top of the skull. Miraculously, he survived. Mary Jane wasn't so fortunate. She was shot 3 times in the head. The attackers fled with the couple's car and several firearms. Police later recovered the murder weapon and matched it to the bullets found at the scene. Stumpf was arrested and charged with aggravated murder, attempted murder, robbery, and firearm theft. During interrogation, Stumpf confessed to shooting Norman, but claimed Wesley had executed Mary Jane. He pled guilty to the charges, and a 3-judge panel sentenced him to death. They cited Stumpf's motive, avoiding arrest, as an aggravating factor under Ohio law. But the legal waters quickly became murky. At Wesley's separate trial, prosecutors reversed their theory. This time, they said Wesley was the mastermind. A jailhouse informant even testified that Wesley had privately confessed to killing Mary Jane. None of that information was presented during Stumpf's sentencing. The inconsistency became a critical point in his appeals. In 2004, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals threw out his death sentence, citing an involuntary plea and contradictory prosecution strategies. But in 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court reinstated the conviction. Despite new evidence and shifting narratives, Stumpf remained on death row. His defense team argued that Stumpf had limited intellectual functioning and was highly suggestible. They also noted the lack of forensic evidence tying him directly to the fatal shots. Still, every appeal was denied. Now nearly 40 years later, John David Stumpf remains incarcerated at Chillicothe Correctional Institution. His execution has been postponed several times due to Ohio's inability to secure lethal injection drugs. The most recent date, August 18, 2027, remains tentative. Meanwhile, Norman Stout has grown old waiting for closure. He's publicly voiced his frustration. "They've kept that man alive longer than Mary Jane's entire family," he once said. "It's not justice. It's a disgrace." From this case, we're left with warnings that stretch beyond any single courtroom. Prosecutors presenting contradictory theories across co-defendants must be held to account. Truth can't shift with strategy. Mental limitations in capital defendants must prompt expert review, not dismissal. A death sentence without clear, consistent proof risks becoming a moral and legal failure. Justice demands not only punishment, but precision. Without it, the system erodes from within. Number 7. Scott A. Group. The downtown bar in Youngstown, Ohio, was quiet that morning. Owners Robert and Sandra Lozier were in the back counting cash. But minutes later, Robert would be dead, and Sandra would lie bleeding, desperately fighting to leave behind a final clue written in blood. On January 18, 1997, Scott A. Group walked into the bar. He had previously worked there as a delivery driver for Ohio Wine Imports. Sandra recognized him. He said he needed to check invoices, a routine excuse. But this visit wasn't about paperwork. Group pulled a revolver and forced the couple into the restroom. He shot Robert once in the head, killing him instantly. Sandra was shot twice, once in the neck, once near the temple. Barely conscious, she managed to scrawl Ohio Wine on the bathroom tile with her own blood. The motive, investigators said, was revenge and theft. Group had recently resigned from Ohio Wine under suspicion of stealing over $1,300. But no charges had been filed. Prosecutors said he returned to silence the couple who might expose him. Sandra survived long enough to identify Group. Police arrested him. The evidence included missing invoices, unaccounted cash, and a comment he made later that night in another bar, "You aren't going to see me anymore." In 1999, a jury convicted Group of aggravated murder, attempted murder, robbery, and intimidation. The verdict qualified him for the death penalty under Ohio law. He was sentenced to die. But Group has always maintained his innocence. He had an alibi. His mother, grandmother, sisters, and a family friend testified he was at home during the time of the murder. Prosecutors countered with forensic evidence, claiming Robert Lozier's blood was found on Group's shoe. That blood evidence is now under scrutiny. The 1997 DNA test analyzed only 9 genetic markers. Modern techniques can analyze up to 24. The Ohio Innocence Project filed a motion in 2025 seeking to retest the sample. If the blood turns out not to be Lozier's, the case could unravel. Still, Ohio courts have consistently upheld the conviction. In 2002, the state Supreme Court affirmed the verdict. A 2018 motion for a new trial was denied. As of 2025, Group remains on death row with an execution date set for February 17, 2027. No new trial has been granted, but the push for DNA retesting continues. For now, the only certain thing is that the case still holds unanswered questions and one survivor's bloodstained message remains etched in memory. This case doesn't just challenge the facts, it challenges the confidence we place in them. And from that, come hard but necessary lessons. All forensic evidence in capital cases must meet modern DNA standards. Outdated tests demand retesting. Eyewitness identifications, especially under duress or trauma, require strong corroboration. Verified alibis must be fully and independently investigated, not brushed aside. Because if we're willing to end a life based on what we once believed, we must be equally willing to reopen the facts we fear to test. Number 8. Shawn Carter. She gave him shelter when no one else would. Raised him, fed him, called him family. But in September 1997, 68-year-old Vader Prince was beaten, raped, and stabbed to death, murdered by the boy she once considered her grandson. Shawn Carter was 18. Homeless after being forced out of his adoptive mother's home, he found refuge with Vader, his adoptive grandmother. She let him stay. He repaid her with unimaginable violence. On the night of September 14th, Carter returned to her home, climbing in through a locked window. Inside, something snapped. He beat Vader with his fists, then stabbed her 18 times. The autopsy revealed brutal head trauma, deep knife wounds, and evidence of anal rape. Carter later confessed, stating he just went off. After the killing, he tried to clean the scene. He washed the knife, rearranged furniture to cover bloodstains, hid Vader's body under clothing, and left a pot on the stove to suggest normalcy. Then he stole her car and fled to Pennsylvania. He was arrested within days. After receiving his Miranda warnings, Carter confessed to the murder in detail. Carter was convicted of aggravated murder, rape, robbery, and trespass. A jury sentenced him to death. The Ohio Supreme Court upheld the sentence, citing the rape and robbery as aggravating factors justifying capital punishment. But Carter's legal journey was far from over. His defense presented a traumatic childhood, abandonment, abuse, and foster care instability. By age 10, he had been adopted but struggled with attachment and impulse control. They argued intoxication and impaired thinking, but the court remained unmoved. Years passed. Carter's mental health worsened. Diagnosed with schizophrenia, he became delusional and incoherent. In 2024, 3 medical experts concluded he was no longer competent to be executed. A judge ruled that while the sentence remains, it cannot be carried out until and unless he regains competence. Both the court and the prosecution, long critical of delays, now agree Carter should be removed from death row temporarily. Not because he's innocent, but because executing a man who cannot grasp his punishment violates both law and ethics. His execution, originally set for January 2025, is now scheduled for November 17, 2027. But even that is uncertain. Ohio's entire death penalty system has stalled. A shortage of lethal injection drugs and a statewide moratorium have put executions on indefinite hold. Meanwhile, the family of Vader Prince stays mostly silent. But their loss reverberates every time Carter's case resurfaces. A woman tried to save him. Instead, she became his victim. And decades later, the legal system remains trapped in a paradox. Can punishment still serve justice if the mind that committed the crime no longer remembers it? Sean Carter remains inside that question. And now, from this tragic case, we draw hard-won lessons. Childhood trauma must trigger early psychological intervention, delaying compound future danger. Mental illness must be consistently evaluated and treated, not just during trial but throughout incarceration. The justice system must adapt. When a person becomes legally incompetent, execution without comprehension is not justice. Justice isn't just about punishing the past, it's about honoring what remains right in the present. From buried secrets to broken systems, the stories you've just heard are more than headlines, they're warnings. Warnings about justice delayed, evidence overlooked, and punishment that may never come. But these are just a few of the names on America's death row. So who's next? Who's innocent? Who's already been forgotten? If you want to be the first to know what happens when the countdown to execution begins, subscribe to Justice Reversed and hit the bell. New cases, new questions, real stories, and only one truth: the system never sleeps and neither do we.